Have you ever wondered what it feels like to step inside the most haunted house in history? Are you brave enough to listen? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more spine-chilling stories. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next terrifying tale. Let's start the story. Nestled in the quiet village of Borley in Essex, the rectory loomed like a forgotten relic. Its dark brick walls seemed to absorb the sunlight, and its countless windows appeared like hollow eyes staring into the soul of anyone who dared approach. Built in 1862 by Reverend Henry Bull, Borley Rectory had earned the ominous title of the most haunted house in England. The story begins in 1929, when paranormal investigator Harry Price received an invitation to the rectory. It was Reverend Lionel Foyster and his wife, Mary Ann, who had written to him, desperately pleading for help. They had moved into the house only a year earlier, and in that time, their lives had become a nightmare. Harry, Lionel had written, "The house is alive. There are voices in the night, footsteps in empty rooms, and a shadowy figure of a nun that lingers in the corridors. I fear for my wife's safety, and I am powerless to stop it." Price arrived on a crisp autumn morning, armed with his equipment, a collection of cameras, notebooks, and devices meant to capture proof of the paranormal. The rectory greeted him with a cold, almost suffocating stillness. Lionel and Mary Ann stood at the gate, their faces pale and lined with sleepless nights. "Welcome to Borley," Lionel said weakly, shaking Price's hand. "I hope you're ready for what lies within double quotes. As they walked through the rectory's grand yet decaying entrance, Mary Ann whispered, "It doesn't like strangers. Be careful." Harry Price had dealt with haunted places before, but Borley Rectory was different. It carried a heavy atmosphere, like walking into a room where someone had just screamed, but left no sound behind. Mary Ann led Price to the dining room, where she pointed to the wall. "It started here," she murmured. There, scrawled on the plaster in a childlike hand, were words that chilled Price to the core. "Mary Ann, please help me." Harry Price stared at the words etched on the wall, the faint light from the nearby window casting shadows over the ominous message. "Who wrote this?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Mary Ann shook her head, her trembling hands clutching her shawl. "We don't know. The writing appeared one morning, and then more followed. Sometimes we hear whispers before it happens, as if the walls themselves are speaking." Price leaned closer to examine the writing. It looked old, the edges faded as though it had been there for years, yet Lionel had assured him it was new. "Has anyone tried painting over it?" "We did," Lionel interjected, his voice tight with frustration. "3 times. It always comes back, and worse. The words change." Price nodded, jotting down notes in his notebook. He decided to inspect the rest of the house, beginning with the infamous Blue Room, known for being the coldest and most unsettling part of the rectory. The moment he stepped inside, a shiver crawled up his spine. The room was unnaturally cold, far colder than the rest of the house. Price could see his breath forking in the air. The Blue Room was sparsely furnished, its once elegant decor now reduced to peeling wallpaper and a cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. "This is where Mary Ann feels it the most," Lionel said, standing by the doorway as if afraid to enter. "She's been pushed, scratched, and once she was nearly thrown down the stairs." Mary Ann's face turned pale at the mention of the incident. "I don't remember it," she whispered. "I blacked out, but Lionel found me at the bottom of the staircase. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive." Price studied the room carefully, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. That's when he noticed a faint smell of burning, like scorched fabric. He turned to the Foysters. "Do you smell that?" Mary Ann nodded. "It comes and goes. Sometimes it's stronger. Other times it's barely there." Just as Price was about to set up one of his cameras, a loud crash echoed from the corridor outside. Lionel flinched, and Mary Ann let out a gasp. "Stay here," Price instructed, rushing out to investigate. He followed the sound to a long hallway lined with portraits of past rectors. One of the frames lay on the floor, shattered glass scattered across the floorboards. Price knelt down, examining the fallen portrait. It was of Reverend Henry Bull, the first rector of Borley. His stern eyes seemed to glare at Price even through the cracked glass. "Did anyone touch this?" "No one," Lionel said, appearing behind him. "The house, it doesn't like us prying into its secrets." That night, Price decided to conduct his ANC in the Blue Room, hoping to communicate with the entity that haunted the rectory. Mary Ann was hesitant but agreed to join, while Lionel opted to stay in the safety of the sitting room, citing his unease with the supernatural. As the three of them sat around a small wooden table, Price lit a candle and began to call out to the spirits. "If there is anyone here, make yourself known. We mean no harm. We only wish to understand." For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained silent except for the faint crackling of the candle. But then, the temperature dropped even further, and the candle flame flickered violently. A low, guttural moan filled the air, sending chills down their spines. Mary Ann gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "It's here," she whispered. Suddenly, the table began to shake, rattling against the floor. Price held firm, his voice steady as he continued. "Who are you? Why do you haunt this place?" The moan grew louder, almost deafening, and then, with a force that knocked them back, the candle was snuffed out. Darkness consumed the room, and in that darkness, a single whisper cut through the silence. "Leave, now." For a moment, none of them moved. The voice, low, raspy, and impossibly close, sent waves of terror coursing through their veins. Price fumbled in the darkness, his hands shaking as he reached for the matches in his pocket. With a spark, he relit the candle, its feeble light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Mary Ann sat frozen, her eyes wide with fear. "It spoke to us," she whispered. "It doesn't want us here." Price, ever the skeptic, steadied his voice. "It's what we're here to find out, but whatever we're dealing with, it's intelligent." The door to the Blue Room creaked open, as though something or someone was standing just beyond it. Price stood, candle in hand, and cautiously approached the door. He peered into the hallway, its emptiness stretching into darkness. A faint sound reached his ears like the distant rustle of fabric or the swish of a long skirt. He turned back to Mary Ann. "You said the legend of Borley involves a nun. Do you believe it's her?" Mary Ann nodded hesitantly. "The villagers talk about her. They say she was bricked alive into the walls of the rectory for breaking her vows. She was in love with a monk." "That's not just a story," Lionel said, appearing in the doorway. His face was pale. "I've seen her at least. I think I have. She walks the garden at night, her veil flowing as though caught in a breeze no one else can feel." Price raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't think to tell me this earlier?" "I didn't want to believe it," Lionel snapped. "But if you're staying the night, you'll see her. She always shows herself when the clock strikes midnight." At the stroke of midnight, Price sat in the garden, his camera ready. The moon cast a silver glow over the overgrown hedges and ivy-covered walls. The air was still, yet heavy with an unexplainable tension. Mary Ann and Lionel watched from the window, their faces pale as ghosts themselves. As the clock in the rectory chimed 12, Price heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Slowly, he turned, his camera poised, and there she was, the nun. She glided across the garden, her figure translucent, her face obscured by the long veil that draped over her shoulders. She moved with an otherworldly grace, her form flickering in and out of existence, like a flame about to be extinguished. Price snapped a photo, the flash briefly illuminating the garden. When the light faded, the nun was gone. The garden was silent once more. He lowered his camera, his heart pounding. "I got her," he muttered to himself. But as he turned to head back inside, something caught his eye. Fresh footprints in the gravel. They led to the rectory's wall and stopped abruptly, as though she had walked straight through it. Back inside, Price developed the photograph in the dim light of his portable darkroom. As the image appeared, his breath caught in his throat. There she was, unmistakable, a veiled figure standing beneath the old elm tree in the garden. But there was something else. In the photograph, a second figure loomed behind the nun. It was taller, darker, its features indistinguishable but unmistakably malevolent. Its eyes seemed to burn through the photo, pinning Price with an otherworldly gaze. What is that?" Mary Ann asked, her voice trembling as she peered over his shoulder. Price shook his head. "I don't know. But it's not the nun. Something else is here. At that moment, the temperature in the room plummeted. The windows frosted over, and the faint sound of whispering filled the air. It was everywhere, coming from the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. And then the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening bang. The door to the room slammed shut, trapping them inside. The voice returned, louder this time, reverberating through the walls. Leave or suffer. The voice echoed through the room, leaving them paralyzed with terror. Price's candle flickered, the flame barely holding on in the freezing air. Mary Ann clutched Lionel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Who are you?" Price shouted, his voice trembling but defiant. "What do you want from us?" The reply came immediately, a chilling hiss that seemed to originate from everywhere at once. "This is my domain. You will not defile it." Suddenly, the room began to shake. The walls groaned and creaked as if the house itself was alive, enraged at their presence. Mary Ann let out a terrified scream as one of the bookshelves toppled over, narrowly missing her and Lionel. Price lunged toward the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force held it shut. He turned back to Mary Ann and Lionel. "We need to get out of here, now." The whispers returned, overlapping and growing louder with every passing second. Words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. Mary Ann's eyes darted around the room, wide with terror. "It's coming closer," she cried. Price's gaze fell on the photograph he had developed, still lying on the table. The dark figure in the background seemed more prominent now, as if it were stepping forward, closer to the nun and closer to them. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, as the whispers reached a crescendo. Then, without warning, the temperature spiked. It was no longer freezing but oppressively hot, as if they were standing in the mouth of a furnace. A horrible, sulfuric stench filled the room, making them gag. Bam! The door flew open with such force that it shattered against the wall, but instead of freedom, the hallway outside was pitch black and unnatural darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe. "Don't go out there," Lionel warned. "It's a trap." Price hesitated, torn between staying in the shaking, malevolent room or stepping into the abyss beyond. The whispers had stopped now, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the darkness outside the door. Mary Ann clutched her necklace, a small cross she always wore, and began muttering a prayer under her breath. The growl grew louder, as if mocking her attempt at faith, and then a shape emerged from the shadows in the hallway. It wasn't the nun. The figure was impossibly tall, its head nearly scraping the ceiling. Its form was distorted, its limbs too long, its posture hunched yet menacing, its eyes burning red and unblinking fixed on them. It stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. Marion screamed. Lionel backed away, dragging her with him. Price grabbed the nearest object he could find, a chair, and held it in front of him like a shield. The figure paused at the threshold of the door, as if savoring their terror. Then it spoke, its voice deep and guttural, each word dripping with malice. "You were warned." The lights in the room exploded, plunging them into complete darkness. Panic consumed them as the growling intensified, now surrounding them from every direction. Price fumbled for his flashlight, but when he turned it on, the beam revealed something he would never forget. The nun stood inches from his face, her veil fluttering as though caught in a phantom wind. Her eyes, empty sockets filled with an unnatural glow, stared straight into his soul. She raised a skeletal hand and pointed behind him. Price turned the flashlight beam toward the spot she indicated. The monstrous figure loomed over Mary Ann and Lionel. The two of them screamed as the creature lunged, its long, clawed arms reaching for them. Price acted on instinct, grabbing Mary Ann and pulling her away. Lionel wasn't so lucky. The creature's claws dug into his shoulder, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. "Run!" Lionel screamed, his voice a mix of pain and desperation. "Save yourselves." Price didn't need to be told twice. Dragging a sobbing Mary Ann behind him, he bolted for the broken door. The darkness tried to swallow them, the whispers and growls chasing them down the corridor. Doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off their escape routes one by one. Finally, they burst into the garden, gasping for air. The night was eerily silent, as if the house had spat them out and closed its jaws behind them. Price turned back, expecting the creature to follow, but nothing came. The house stood still, its windows dark and lifeless. Mary Ann collapsed onto the ground, clutching her knees. It took him, she sobbed. It took Lionel. Price stared at the rectory, his mind racing. We need to come back, he muttered. We need to figure out what this thing is. Mary Ann looked at him as if he were insane. Go back? Are you mad? We barely escaped alive. But Price's determination was unshaken. We've uncovered something no one else has. This isn't just a haunting. This is something far darker. As he spoke, a cold breeze swept through the garden, carrying with it a faint whisper that chilled them to the bone. You can run, but you'll never escape. The whisper lingered in the air, sending shivers down Mary Ann's spine. She clung to Price, tears streaking her face, while the cold night seemed to grow darker and more oppressive around them. The rectory loomed behind them, a silent predator watching their every move. Price knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. We can't leave Lionel behind, he said firmly. We have to go back. If we don't, that thing, whatever it is, will consume him. Mary Ann shook her head violently. You saw it. You saw what it did. It's not just a ghost, Harry, it's evil. It'll kill us all. Price glanced back at the house, his jaw tightening. I'm not leaving him to that fate, he muttered. If you won't help me, then I'll go alone. Mary Ann stared at him, horrified. You're insane. But there was no time to argue. Price was already walking back toward the rectory, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air grew heavy, thick with malevolence. The whispers returned, faint but growing louder with each step he took. Price gripped the flashlight tightly, his knuckles white, as he retraced his steps to the room where Lionel had been taken. Lionel, he called out, his voice trembling. If you can hear me, say something. The only response was the groan of the floorboards beneath his feet. The house felt alive, as if it were watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at him. Price reached the doorway to the room. His flashlight flickered as he stepped inside. The air was freezing again, and the sulfuric stench was back, stronger than ever. The photograph on the table was gone. Lionel, Price shouted again, more urgently this time. A faint, agonized moan came from the far corner of the room. He swung the flashlight beam toward it and gasped. Lionel was there, crumpled on the floor, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His clothes were torn, and his shoulder bore deep, bloody gashes where the creature's claws had struck him. He looked up at Price with hollow, sunken eyes. It won't let us leave, he croaked. Price rushed to his side, pulling him to his feet. We're getting out of here, he said firmly, though his voice wavered. I'm not leaving you behind. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The growl returned, louder and more menacing than ever. Price spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. The creature was there, blocking their path. Its red eyes glowed like embers, and its twisted grin revealed rows of jagged, blackened teeth. It raised one clawed hand and pointed directly at Price. You cannot take him, it snarled. He belongs to me now. Price tightened his grip on Lionel and stepped back, his mind racing. You can't have him, he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. He's coming with me. The creature laughed a horrible, guttural sound that shook the very walls of the room. "You dare defy me? Then you will share his fate." Before Price could react, the creature lunged, its claws swiping at him. He barely managed to pull Lionel out of the way as the creature's hand slammed into the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. Price stumbled backward, dragging Lionel with him. His flashlight fell from his hand, the beam spinning wildly across the room. In the chaos, Mary Ann's voice suddenly rang out from the hallway. "Harry, get out of there!" She was holding a lantern, its light glowing brightly despite the oppressive darkness. She stepped into the room, her face pale but determined, and raised the cross on her necklace. "Leave them alone," she shouted at the creature. "You have no power here." The creature recoiled, its grin vanishing. It snarled, its red eyes narrowing. But it didn't move closer. The light from the lantern seemed to hold it at bay, forming a protective barrier around them. Price didn't waste a moment. He grabbed Lionel and staggered toward Mary Ann. Together, they stumbled out of the room and into the hallway, the whispers and growls chasing them as they ran. They burst out into the garden, the night air hitting them like a wave of relief. Mary Ann dropped the lantern, and its light dimmed as she fell to her knees, trembling. Price helped Lionel to the ground, checking his wounds. For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, catching their breath. The rectory stood behind them, dark and still, as if the house had retreated into itself. Price finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "It let us go." Mary Ann shook her head. "No, it didn't. It's still watching." Lionel raised his head, his voice weak but certain. "It's not over. That thing, it doesn't just haunt this house. It's bound to us now." Price stared at the rectory, a sense of dread settling over him. He knew Lionel was right. They had escaped, but the malevolent force within the house had marked them. No matter where they went, it would follow. As they made their way back to the car, a single whisper drifted through the night, so faint they almost didn't hear it. "You are mine."